All right, kia ora koutou. I'm Kenny. I'm an economist. I'm sorry. As Mark mentioned, well, firstly, thank you to Mark for opening the day, and to Jenny also. I'll be talking about actually three projects that I and my colleagues have worked on about this concept of signals. So these are sort of factors that influence producer decision making. And I actually only worked on one of them, so I'm really only going to talk to you in detail about one of these three projects, but on behalf of my colleagues, I'll talk about the other two very briefly at the start. So the first project tries to answer this question: what are the signals that New Zealand land stewards and New Zealand producers respond to most when making land use change decisions? You all know that there is a lot of things that sort of are relevant for decision making for producers, both off farm and on farm. The things that this project determined were most important have these characteristics. So, does this work? So those important signals, those ones that producers respond to most, are relevant, certain, consistent, come from trusted sources, come with ongoing support, and I'll move on to the second project. So the second project was sort of followed on from the first, and it tried to understand, well, how can we actually make some of those systems better for support? So specifically thinking about how can we support catchment groups? And so answering this research question, how can funding and support for catchment groups, collective action groups, more generally, to improve community resilience and environmental outcomes?
Kenny, we want to see you the link. There's a very good microphone there, just around the other half.
Sure.
Just for the video.
Sure. Okay. And so this project found that so funding and support should be focusing on these long-term and complex changes rather than sort of stuff that is more routine. It found that there was lack of coordination, so improving things could mean coordinating with other providers of funding and support, and providing more sort of tools for decision makers to make decisions. So other speakers will talk about that supermarket. That's an example of one of those sets of data sets. And it developed this very nice tool. I won't tell you too much about the Swift tool, but it helps catchment groups and supporters and funders of catchment groups make decisions that are relevant to those groups. All right, so I'll move on to the project I actually worked on. So this project was very policy focused. So we were trying to understand what policies would be required to meet the goals embedded in these two pieces of legislation. So National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management 2020 sets freshwater quality targets, and the Climate Change Response Act Zero Carbon Amendment sets targets for greenhouse gases. And specifically, we were trying to understand, well, what policies will be required to meet these targets in legislation between sort of investing more in extension, so investing more in spending on things like catchment groups, rural advisor consults, courses for producers, those sorts of things, as well as setting incentives using pollution pricing, so both for greenhouse gases and nutrients. And so mostly this talk is going to be about the messages that we're sort of going to be communicating to central government. They're the main audience for this, but hopefully there are some things in here which are relevant for you. And it does sort of paint a picture of the future which is certainly going to be relevant for the people in this room. So what do we do to answer that question of what will it take? We set up this really big simulation model of all producers for 25 years across the country. And so this is a simulation model existing on a computer that's got virtual producers that are making choices about their land use, making choices about their mitigation, their land management. And those choices of those virtual producers then determine their financial outcomes and also their pollution outcomes, so their greenhouse gas emissions as well as their nutrient losses. The core of this model is really about making financial decisions. So it's people choosing what is the best financial decision for them, However, we do know that that's not exactly how it works in the real world, so we introduce a lot of things which try to account for that real world decision-making behaviour that isn't quite that sort of economics ideal of people choosing the thing that makes them the most money. So we introduce things like not perfectly optimising the farm, having direct concern for the environment. We have these sort of different dimensions of capability where people can learn about new topics, new land uses, and sort of learn those things over time, and with slow adjustment as well. So producers aren't responding instantly to a change in that policy environment. It's taking some time for them to move towards their target behaviour. So this is not the first land use model in New Zealand, so it's probably about the fifth, I think, but there's a bunch of things we do to try and make it unique, trying to make it open, make it available to other researchers. It's got national coverage at that some farm scale. We make really good use of those data sets that Jenny mentioned on the supermarket. We're making use of the sort of wealth of information that others at Our Land and Water have provided in terms of freshwater quality assessment and land use performance across the country. So there's a lot I can talk about what we did, but I really want to talk to you about results. So I'm going to start moving on to results. The first scenario of results I'll show you is what we're calling the status quo. So this has sort of the big assumptions in this scenario are that we've got a $70 carbon price growing to $100 by 2050. It's gone down since we changed that number to about 60, but it's not going to change conclusions too much if that was a little bit lower. And about $200 million a year of extension investment, and no pollution pricing for greenhouse gases or water quality. Do want to tell you the results, but I just want you to stop for a moment. All models are wrong. This is no exception. All models are sensitive to the inputs, and we're still working on the inputs for this model. So I was just talking to Olivier earlier. He sounds like he had something we might be able to use in this model. And so, yeah, the next time you see results, things might look different. And before I show you the results, I just want to show you some of those key inputs. So this is sort of histogram of operating profit for dairy on the right and sheep and beef on the left. And what I've plotted on top is 3 equivalent measures of profitability for carbon forestry at different carbon prices. So the first one is $20 a tonne. That's a pretty low carbon price. And that's showing that carbon forestry is outcompeting about half of all sheep and beef land in our model. At $70, which is the number we use, is outcompeting almost all sheep and beef land in the model. And at $100, which is where it ends up, it's even outcompeting some dairy land. So this, when you see the results, keep in mind this graph. This is really driving a lot of what you're going to see. So what happens out to 2050 in terms of land use? So that's this left graph. It's just area on the y-axis for these different categories. Big investment in carbon forestry, growing immensely at the expense of sheep and beef land. So big exit from sheep and beef is what this model is telling us into carbon forestry, and even some exit from dairy land as well. The right graph shows our sort of summary of the pollution targets in those pieces of legislation. So the sort of this line here is the greenhouse gas targets, and this is the water quality targets down here. The greenhouse gas targets actually get met in this model, in the status quo, and that's because of that big exit from pasture farming into carbon forestry. Still got progress to make on nutrients, so we don't quite get all the way there for progress on nutrients in this model. All right, so it seems crazy. It's got to be too big, but let's just try and ground it in some data first. So the left graph here shows real-world land use trends from 2002 to 2019. And sheep and beef land has been declining in the sort of Stats NZ data set, so about 2% a year over that period. At the same time, we've seen a really big increase in the carbon price. So 2019 is actually here. So all of that's happening at low carbon prices. Not much of this is actually carbon forestry. But since then, we've had this big increase in the carbon price, which has really changed those incentives for producers significantly. So maybe sheep and beef land declining at 2.8% under that high carbon price is not so crazy. Big story here is that sheep and beef is outcompeted by carbon forestry. Just keep going now. So what happens if we don't have the ETS, if we don't have that price on forest carbon? How do things actually look different in the future if that was to be removed? Basically the same as before, just no carbon price. We actually still have decline in sheep and beef land, pretty significant decline, obviously much less forestry, and our model is showing some increase in dairy land. Not much going on with arable and hort in either graph actually, so that's something which we've found interesting. But removing the carbon price from the ETS definitely comes at the expense of those pollution goals. So if that were to happen, then you would need sort of other mechanisms to address those pollution goals if they were to be met. So, story here is that the emissions trading scheme induces these very large changes. We should expect something like this to happen if forestry stays in the ETS. What's really happening here is that radiata pine is actually pretty clean for water quality and other greenhouse gases. And so that's why, sort of moving into that radiata forestry, you get those big co-benefits for those other pollution outcomes. There's been a little bit of work on sort of trying to value the downsides of wilding pines, but those would also apply equally to production forestry. And those have been valued at about 200 per year, so it's not insignificant, but not high enough to really change the incentives substantially at those high carbon prices. So, what do we get when we actually try and meet the goals with those policies, with those pollution prices? So this next one puts $600 million a year into extension. That's tripling the current budget, and then put some pollution prices on water quality. So I've got the prices up here. They might mean something to you. They probably mean more to you than they do to me. But importantly, we're meeting the greenhouse gas goals already, so we don't worry about prices on those. So we're using spatially explicit or sort of local pollution targets, and so we actually only need nutrient pricing on 20% of non-forest land. When we do that, the story of land use change is actually really quite similar. The big difference is that there's more decline in dairy land in this model under that pricing. So a lot of those places that are out of compliance are in dairy land, and so you end up with more land going into forestry. But we do meet the targets with those prices. Again, interesting, not much going on with arable and hort. However, and this is very relevant for this audience, the impacts that we're simulating on producers are huge. So greater than 50% reduction in profits for those regulated. This is just too big to be politically feasible, we think. So a lot of that money that is being taxed from the industry would have to be returned in some sort of way through something like a land dividend or sort of other subsidies in some sort of way. So that's certainly calling into question the feasibility of these targets for water quality, I think. Now, just to sort of look at the big picture of how profits look under this scenario. So the top part here is sort of total producer profit in the model across the three of arable, hort, dairy, and sheep and beef, 2025 and 2050. And you can see, so all that capability building is helping a lot for arable and hort. So there's a lot more money in arable and hort. Dairy profits still maintain to some extent, so that's not sort of an aggregate looking too bad because you've got that building of capability over time. Looking grim for sheep and beef, of course, but all of that new forestry is actually a lot of money for producers in aggregate. How does this look when we compare it to the overall greenhouse gas goals? It's significant. The y-axis here is the carbon sequestered by the forestry in our model. So that's blue line going up over time. This dashed line is our current gross annual CO2 emissions. So we're basically projecting net zero in CO2 by 2040. And this other line is our projection of aggregate emissions, including those agricultural emissions. And so that's looking at to be sort of net zero, but after 2045 in this scenario. Importantly, if anyone knows any economics, if you've got this much CO2 sequestration, you can't maintain those carbon prices without selling them outside of the country. So you would need to be developing export markets for carbon reductions to be able to support those prices that we've got in the model. But that's not sort of far from out of the question. So there are international deals out there to remove carbon, and so we could, if we're looking at this sort of future, we could be thinking about developing that as an export market, selling it to places like Switzerland who are struggling to meet their obligations, and bring some money into the country through that type of export mechanism. Importantly, sort of the incentives of levy-funded industry bodies is to maintain production. So this is really a story of land use change, reductions in production. That's very much at odds with the incentives of those levy-funded bodies. Critical thing to worry about, in my view, is that job loss associated with this. So it doesn't take many people to grow carbon forestry. And so that's going to have some implications for rural communities. And it limits the options for native biodiversity in the future as well. So that's another sort of big consideration here when we're thinking about this as sort of the logical conclusion of these policies that are currently on the books, and we will be watching that space to see how things change, of course. And I've mentioned this as well, but something would need to be done if that sort of pollution pricing was introduced to support producers. So something like recycling revenue or a long lead-in time. We didn't see much with arable and hort, and so part of that is just there's sort of limited land availability that can support those land uses, So there are some things that can be done to support producers to move towards those sort of higher value land uses, like local feasibility studies. I'm sure others will talk about this issue today as well. Coordinating marketing and processing is another thing that can help those land uses along. And a big reason we actually don't sort of have a lot of native bush in our project is it's quite expensive to plant. And so there's, I think, a lot of gains to be made in reducing the costs of planting out native bush. And we don't have a biodiversity incentive at all. So that's another thing which could help along native bush. So it's not just pine trees all over the country. All right, I think we're going pretty well for time, so we'll go over this last bit. So just to remind you, the point of this project, we were trying to figure out, well, what's the extension investment and what's the pollution pricing that you would need to actually meet these goals. We talked a lot about the pollution pricing, but not so much about the extension. So one way to examine that is just to see, well, how far can you get with that extension investment alone? So this is same sort of tripling of the extension system in this scenario, but without the pollution pricing. The answer is there's really not much movement in pollution goals. We can sort of talk at length maybe later about why that is. So people are learning more, but they're getting better at being producers in their existing land use, so they're changing land use less as well. So that's sort of those two things compete with each other when you're investing in extension, and so you can end up with something like what we've got here, where you're really hardly moving the dial on pollution goals by investing in that type of extension, which ends up coming at the expense of land use change into forestry. So you can see sort of this graph here shows the relative changes in land use versus through the scenario. So we get less forestry, but we also get more dairy, more arable and hort. And so the idea for the dairy is that you're better at cleaning up your system, so you're much more likely to stay in it. That's the story there, or much more likely to move into it if you can sort of have a cleaner system. All right, so I think we can move on to discussion. So this is one question I have for the room. So at these high carbon prices, there's a big incentive for change, especially from sheep and beef farming. People are selling up now, but it's not sort of at the scale that you might expect if people were sort of trying to be those sort of financial optimizers. And so, why are things so slow? And I guess is the other sort of points maybe to discuss could be on here, but I'll just move on to any questions. Yep.
Your carbon price, your ETS price, $100 by 2050.
Yep.
How'd you reach that?
It was a projection of the futures pathway. So we've got 5 years of future carbon prices, and so we were basically just extending that out to 2050. So that was the idea there. And $100 is well lower than the peak in the EU. So that got up to about 200 New Zealand, something like that, 150 New Zealand. So it's $100. It would need to be supported through exports at that stage, but it's not sort of outside the realm of possibility, I think.
And do you think forestry will have to be split off as a separate system to export credits?
I don't know the way it would be set up. I mean, it's just the government's making deals. It's really the story there. So I think we would basically be selling New Zealand units overseas would be the mechanism. So that would be it. Yep.
How is the model taking into account land use change regulations and what you can and can't do?
So not really. So that's probably one of the big reasons you see the increase in dairy land. So no, we don't introduce any of those local government regulations or anything like that. No moratoriums in the model. And so we have found that there is land in the model there that kind of wants to be dairy land, but isn't. In our main scenarios, dairy land's going down, so we don't worry too much about trying to dig into all of the policies across the country on land use restrictions. But we do restrict based on capability of the land. So there's a lot of data sets out there on sort of what can grow where, and so we take account of all of that sort of land capability stuff. Yep.
Question over here.
I was just wondering if you're going to be sharing the report so we can have a look at some of the underlying assumptions.
Certainly, yes, I'd love to share it with you. We're still working on it, so watch the space, but I'll get your email or something. Would that be good? Yeah.
Especially around the forestry harvesting and the sustainability around that time period.
So I can briefly answer that point. So we do have both production forestry, like timber forestry, and sort of no harvest carbon forestry in the model. And it's just really assuming a basic profile of growth and then harvest, and carbon revenue based on the settings in the ETS. But carbon forestry is not harvested in the model ever.
Question over the back.
Okay, question for you. So we had a bit of a play with this sort of stuff at a nationwide scale and said, okay, what if we planted all that sensitive catchments up in trees?
Yeah.
Right, theoretically. The impact on export seats was about 26 billion. To put that in perspective,
Yeah.
we made 57 billion. So that's the entire area industry wiped out, planted in trees from an export receipts point of view. So the question here is, and that's 82%.
So you're, let's get that graph up, shall we, this one? Yeah.
So what's the impact from a nationwide earning capacity?
That's significant. If you can't sell this overseas, then it's really significant. So if this is just being sold to people who want to still, not buy an electric ute in 2040, and that sort of thing, then yeah, that's significant. But if you can develop those international markets and carbon removals, that is where you'd end up making this money potentially. And that's not a market which really exists yet for New Zealand in any big way. So that's definitely would need to happen for the sort of NZ Inc. kind of outcomes that you're thinking of.
Will your model later on, John, cover that?
Oh, we'll cover everything right that way.
Yeah.
So we'll have John's model later on may actually be quite useful for that particular conversation about.
I haven't talked to anyone on this side of the room, so should we take one over here?
Okay, my big question with these forestry conversions is
Yeah.
economic models usually use discount rates, which means nothing's really relevant beyond 10 years.
Yeah.
Carbon forestry only pays out for the first 15 years of the first rotation. Landowners are usually interested in the long term.
Yep.
So all these models are favouring forestry because it gives you fast returns. Most farmers are thinking multi-generational for the country. We want an income beyond 10 years. So have you done any long-term modelling with long-term discount rates to kind of consider what happens beyond 15 years of forestry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, so we have our producers in the model have lots of different discount rates. So some of them are like the sort of 6% range. Some of them get down to 2 or 3%. So we do have sort of a range of those sorts of returns. And yes, and your other points were spot on. These numbers here use 6%. So your carbon forestry returns are at that sort of level. I don't quote me too much on this, but I actually think these carbon forestry returns, because this doesn't have any harvest in it, so these ones, so you're getting 50 years of returns for this carbon forestry. I think even at 2 or 3% discount rate, these lines are actually even further out compared to the sort of equivalent for dairy and sheep and beef. If the discount rate's 0, of course, then they go back down. But you have to have really, really low discount rates to get sort of to change the basic conclusion of this graph.
Yeah, for people not changing as fast as the model suggests, it could be something to do with the fact that they're thinking longer term.